Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this cold, snowy Montana night. This is the conclusion of our Holocaust Exhibit programming. When we were putting everything together, we were looking at who we want to bring in as speakers. Uri was at the top of my list. I've had the pleasure of having lunches with Uri, extended conversations with him, and I could think of no better person than to close out this exhibit than Uri. The impact that he has had in our community with the arts, with his leadership, I think all of you probably have a story that you could share about him. Tonight's, whatever Uri shares tonight, I want to give you all the same challenge that I have given previous audiences. I want us to listen, but then I want us to share. Share this with your family, share this with your children, with your grandchildren. Uri and I were talking before you all came in, and he said something very profound, I thought. Every hour, every day, every year, we lose more and more of these survivors, and their stories are lost. That's our responsibility now, to share those stories, to make sure that those stories are not forgotten. We may not ever experience fully what those stories were, but we need to do our darndest to make sure that those who come behind me and my children also know those stories. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Uri Barnea to the podium.
Thanks very much. To begin with, first of all, thank you very much for coming here. My name is Uri, spelled U-R-I, means my light in Hebrew. My last name is Barnea. It's a place in the Sinai Desert. Both are mentioned in the Old Testament. If you want to check, my first name is in Exodus 31, verse 2, and my last name is in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2. I'm a son of Holocaust survivors, and this is why I'm here. I'm really thankful to Gavin, Walter, for inviting me and for putting this exhibit here in the library. I'm sorry, my presentation is not high-tech. I brought a few books and other materials on the Holocaust. They are right there against the wall if you want to check them at the end. Also, towards the end of my presentation, I have a few things to show you. When Gavin invited me to tell my family story, I agreed to do it. But before I recount to you my family's experience in regard to the Holocaust, I need a little time to provide a proper context for both my story and the Holocaust exhibit in the adjacent room. First, let me explain the source of the terms Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Holocaust comes from the Greek. Holo means whole, completely. Caust means burnt. Wholly burnt, completely burnt. Of course, the bodies of so many millions of people were burnt in the crematoria of Auschwitz and Treblinka and other places. But with a small h, it was also used in some translations of the Bible when they were talking about the burnt offering in the temple in Jerusalem. With a capital H, it means the events that occurred between 1933 and 1945. Anti-Semitism, anti, against. Semitism, Sem, was the oldest son of Noah, the biblical Noah, from whose line Abraham came. The term actually was only coined in the early 1870s by one of the most poisonous philosophers, which are German philosophers by the name of Wilhelm Marr, M-A-R-R. You can check on Google the history of Wilhelm Marr, and he wrote a pamphlet against the Jews, and for the first time he used it. So now we use it for any activities that happen against the Jewish people for a lot of time, although Christians and Muslims are also the sons and daughters of Abraham. But eventually it was kind of directed towards the Jews. Next, let me talk briefly about the scope of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Such a huge number is difficult to conceive, so let me give some examples that are more familiar to us. 1,000 people died during Hurricane Katrina. Now think, 6,000 Katrinas. 3,000 people died when the Twin Towers collapsed on 9/11. Now think, 2,000 9/11s. 2,000 9/11s. Even closer to home, 6 times the entire population of Montana. Or, from another angle, the Arlington, Texas stadium can seat 100,000 people. Now think, 60 Arlington stadiums that could accommodate, are you ready? 6 million defense lawyers. Let's call anti-Semitism and any other type of racism by its name. It's a societal disease. And like cancer, the sooner we tackle it, the lesser the damage will occur. Anti-Semitism, in all its various forms, has preceded the Holocaust by hundreds of years. Yet, it has not abated, neither in other countries nor in the US. Here are just a handful of recent headlines from the media. 1. Twitter reinstated neo-Nazi publisher who targeted the whitefish Jewish community. 2. Author has no regret releasing sequel to controversial The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. John Boyne orients his newest book, All the Broken Places, towards adults rather than children, while deflecting criticism for getting facts wrong and sympathizing with Germans over Jews. Author John Boyne says, "It's not my responsibility to justify its use in education." 3. A school board in Tennessee removes from library shelf Art Spiegelman's graphic Holocaust memoir, Mouse. 4. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff to chair White House roundtable with Jewish groups on rising anti-Semitism. 5. Last month at Carnegie Hall, composer Michael Gordon presented an evening-long work titled The Travel Guide to Nicaragua for choir and cello. In a passage about the Nazi massacres of the Jews in Gordon's ancestral village, the keening, impassioned cello takes on the role of a professional mourning brought in to tear through the shocked audience. 6. Not just Kanye. It's an online coalition of hate. TikTok and the dark web don't merely host haters, they merge and amplify their messages, feeding a malignant mix to impressionable online audiences. Finally, Michigan man indicted after accosting synagogue goers while cursing Israel. Now I'd like to offer a slightly different, more philosophical take than the more common historical one on this Holocaust exhibit. I want to bring this whole topic a lot closer to us here in this room. This exhibit is unlike any other exhibit. Why? Because it highlights the greatest atrocity perpetrated against humans by humans. When you go to the Louvre to see Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, you might say to yourself, what a beautiful piece of art. How in the world was Leonardo able to do it? In contrast, when you see this exhibit, you might say to yourself, what a horrifying thing. How were those people able to do it? We have the beautiful in us, and we have the ugly in us. Last month, I opened this exhibit by saying that, in my opinion, the only productive way to view this exhibit is to see ourselves in these photos, whether as victims or perpetrators. It may have been just a coincidence that it was others, not us, who were transported to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. You probably have heard the expression by someone saying, I could never have done such a terrible thing. Really? Sorry. But the rabbi in me prompts me to say that the story about the Garden of Eden was not about some remote, unthought of figures named Adam and Eve. It was, and still is, about us. It was we who disobeyed God. 2 chapters later, it was not about two remote, unthought of figures named Cain and Abel. It was about us. We are both Cain and Abel. We are both the perpetrator and the victim. So when we deal with anti-Semitism or the Holocaust, what I often find missing is the expression of tremendous pain and of utter outrage. Back to the Cain and Abel story in Genesis chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, we read, Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. We can hear the biblical narrator expressing to us the deep trauma and God's outrage of the murder of Abel. I bet there is no one in this room who has not experienced either physical and or emotional pain, real, horrible, endless pain. Please take a few seconds to remember such an event in your own life. So, if we all know what real pain is, why would we inflict it on others? Some of the reasons for our hateful behavior may stem from innate fear, from greed, and especially from our ego. All too complicated subjects of which I cannot speak now, but I still want us to think about them. Back to the subject of this exhibit. I think that you don't get the essence of it if, at the end, you do not feel a sense of trauma, of pain, and of outrage. Perhaps you have heard, as I have, people describe the Holocaust as an unimaginable atrocity and cruelty. But maybe it's time for us to realize that it is imaginable, because, even if not on the same scale, this type of butchering of human beings by human beings has continued during the past 80 years since the Holocaust. We know what happened in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Darfur, in Kosovo, and lately in Ukraine. This is happening in our own time. And anti-Semitism continues to spread around the world and even in Montana. We need to do something about it. First, we need to cleanse our own hearts and minds. We need to begin respecting human beings, no matter how different they may be from you and me. And we need to educate our children and teens to do the same. In War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy wrote, "For us, with the rules of right and wrong given us by the Lord, there is nothing for which we have no standard. And there is no greatness where there is no honesty, goodness, and truth." Honesty, goodness, and truth. Let me close this introduction with the famous words of the German pastor Martin Niemöller. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Now to my own story. I'm going to divide it into 4 stories, and I'll try to be really efficient in telling it, because I could use hours and hours. So, the stories will be first about my grandparents. I will not mention many names. Here and there I might mention names. The next story will be about my parents and what happened to them. The third story will be about a remote relative and what happened to him, which has great significance to me. And the fourth is about my own family, the 4 of us, my wife and my 2 children, who went to Europe twice to commemorate our ancestors right there, and I'll tell you a little bit more in detail. I'll start from my father. I did not hear much from my father at all. My father was closed like a clam about whatever happened to him. There are many Jews who cannot speak about what happened to them. Everything I know about him and his family, I learned from my mother. He opened up to my mother, but not to us children. So I know that his father came from actually Lithuania, emigrated to Berlin, where my father was born. My grandfather, his father, died by an accident in 1923. My father's mother and my grandfather had 4 children. My father was first, then another brother, then a sister, and then the 4th brother. My father stayed the last in Germany. The second brother left with my grandmother to Palestine in 1934, a year after Hitler came to power. There was still enough time for them to get documents for legal immigration into Palestine, which was under the British mandate, and they settled in Tel Aviv. This uncle of mine was an architect. I'll speak a little bit about him and my grandmother a little bit later. The last brother left in 1936. He was married, as well as my second, the other uncle, and they left for Buenos Aires. The sister, and I will name her, Ruth, fled to France, and they never heard back again from her, ever. We don't know what happened. She thought that France was secure at the time, but as we know, Hitler came into France as well. My father, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents. They were born in what is now Poland, but they moved to Leipzig, about 120 miles southeast of Berlin, where my mother was born. But eventually they moved into Berlin. This grandparent was a textile merchant, very successful. They had a bourgeois type of life. They were very comfortable. But he also served in First World War at the time when, for us Jews, it's hard to conceive the German Jews fought against the French Jews. They probably killed each other while doing that. He even got the Iron Cross. As you will see later, nothing helped in that respect. His wife, my maternal grandmother, was first a housewife, and then when he was drafted to the army, she went and worked for the post office from 7 o'clock in the evening until maybe 8 o'clock at night. So my mother and her brother moved to live with my maternal grandparents, great-grandparents, who lived just a few blocks away in Leipzig. The details that we know today are the result of the meticulous documents that the Germans have kept and eventually fell into the hands of the Red Cross and to the hands of the Allies. So my maternal grandparents were deported from their home in Berlin to Theresienstadt, also known as Terezin, in Czechoslovakia, on September 14, 1942. By then, my mother was in Palestine. I'll tell you later about that. My grandfather perished in the Theresienstadt almost 2 years later, on the 3rd of July, 1944. My grandmother was taken on the penultimate train from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz and was murdered there on October 9th, 1944. My uncle, my mother's brother, was a musician. Just before Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 1938, he escaped to Czechoslovakia, believing that the Nazis will not go there. As we know, they first went for the Sudetenland, but not all the way to Prague. He studied music in the conservatoire in Prague. He was an oboist, clarinetist, organist, and a very good singer. There he met another young lady, a Jewish lady, who was a terrific pianist. She went once to his recitals and immediately fell in love with him, and then she decided to switch from the class for soloists to the class of accompanists so she can work with him. Eventually they got married. I'll tell you also a little bit about her. She survived Auschwitz. So my uncle, my mother's brother, was deported from his apartment in Prague to Theresienstadt also on March 22nd, 1943. So it's about a year after my grandparents. Fewer than 6 months later, on September 6, 1943, he was transported to what was called the family camp, especially for Jews who came from Czechoslovakia, in Auschwitz, and was murdered there on March 8th, 1944. As I said, we have all these dates from Yad Vashem, which is the greatest museum in Israel, and also Czechoslovakia has a terrific archives, and so does the German government and other institutions who help us very much in our trip later on. We assume, I don't know how many of you know of or have seen the movie Playing for Time. It's with Vanessa Redgrave about the musicians in Auschwitz who had played for the Nazi officers, but also for the marching Jews into the crematoria. We have no proof of that, but it is most likely that my uncle was part of that Auschwitz orchestra. Switching to my parents. My father was also a merchant, and he finally became a manager of a large tobacco sort of chain of stores. He did very well. And apparently he had some friends in the government that helped him to stay in Germany, because he left in 1940. In August of 40, that was almost a year after the Second World War started. He ended up in Vienna, in a hotel that hosted a lot of Jews. Two ladies, he played the piano. Two ladies heard him play the piano and just were completely mesmerized by him. He was also very good looking. My mother, I don't know if you know about that, but an organization in Palestine is called the Haganah, which means the defense, actually worked hand in hand in the early days with Germany. And they said, you know, you want to kick all the Jews out, we will help you with that. We will rent all the ships that will take them out of Germany, and if you allow us, we would like to have some training camps for farming and for whatever else you need once you move to Palestine. And so on the border of Poland, there were some of those training camps, and my mother was a Zionist, and she decided she's going to go to one of those camps. And, but not after, she was actually a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, and later on she became a nurse in the Jewish hospital, the maternity wing of the hospital. And she actually told us that there was a huge flow of pregnant women on the night of Kristallnacht, of course, because of the trauma. They had many, many more ladies who gave birth on that night, or actually 2 nights, the 9th and the 10th of November. She also took the train in August and also ended up in Vienna. I don't believe that they met there. From there, the Haganah arranged for a train to take them to Bratislava. Dana Smith was telling me here about Bratislava. It has some meaning to her family. Bratislava is now in Slovakia. It was then under Czechoslovakia, but also under the Nazis. There waited 3 ships, actually tiny ships. The Milos, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. They carried approximately 3,000 refugees. Bratislava sits right on the Danube. They went down the Danube. They were stopped many times by the Nazis, just trying to see that there are no spies or whatever there is. Around Greece, they ran out of coal to have the ship's engines work, and the captain told them to start destroying every available piece of furniture on the ship. So chairs, tables, even bunk beds, they all went into the furnace to have the ship continue. They went through the Black Sea, and from there to the Mediterranean. And on the ship, there was a lady by the name of Fortuna. When they left in September, early September 1940, she was 7 months pregnant already. As they got closer to the port of Haifa, she gave birth to a baby girl. Since my mother was she had this knowledge of working with mothers of new baby, she stayed with the baby because the mother became sick, and they stayed at the bottom of the ship. They entered, all 3 ships entered the harbor of Haifa on the 5th of November, 1940. All of them came as illegal immigrants because the British government allowed only 15,000 passengers to enter Palestine legally, and everybody else was either shipped back to Cyprus or to the island of Mauritius, which is in Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal. That was the plan for the 3 ships. But then the British discovered that the Pacific was in such a bad shape that it would not be able to make the trip to Mauritius. And the people from the Haganah came secretly on the ship. And there were, of course, all kind of secret agents, British agents on the ship. And they started to transport all the passengers of the Pacific, including my future parents, to another ship that's called Patria, the Patria, which means land or country, which was in much better shape. The people from the Haganah said, no way, that's not going to happen. They made all the trip for 2 months to Haifa. They're not going to go anywhere. Well, what do? Well, what they did is they planned to bomb the ship. They waited for the morning count when all the passengers have to be on deck. They smuggled explosives into the ship, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 25th of November, a huge bomb exploded on the Patria. My mother and the baby were at the bottom of the ship. The ship immediately turned on its side. My mother finally somehow found an empty suitcase. She put the baby in the suitcase, and somehow she found her way into the spiraling steps into the top deck. She shouted to the British sailors who came already to the ship, catch the suitcase, there is a baby there, and then she jumped in the sea and was saved by the British sailors. My father in the morning was actually on the deck, so he jumped immediately. Unfortunately, more than 250 people drowned to their death as a result. There was also a 6-year-old boy, my mother told me. She became very close to him by the name of Peter. And unfortunately, 6-year-old Peter also drowned. My mother found out later. Now, according to the Geneva Convention, when you are a survivor of a shipwreck, you cannot be sent back to your country. You have to let the people ashore. So that's what the British did. They put all the wet people who survived into that warehouse. By the way, the other 2 ships, they didn't have that luck. They did go all the way to Mauritius, and the people on those ships waited there until the end of the Second World War. For 5 years, they waited on that island, also under British control. From there, the British took the people into a detention camp, not a concentration camp, detention camp, where the men and the women were separated and allowed only 1 hour to go and see each other from both sides of the barbed wire. They had bunk beds and variety of. It was very primitive. The food was awful, but it was not. Although the showers that they had to go through for disinfection reminded them, of course, by then they knew the story of the showers, and that was not thrilling, to say the least. I visited that camp twice, and I will leave this on the table here, but if you can see from the back, this is a postcard from this camp. It's called Atlit. It's about 20 miles south of Haifa on the Mediterranean Sea, and today it's a museum. You can go and look at all the barracks and everything, and there's even a shipwreck on the compound there. And in fact, I'm going to visit it one more time this February. I'm going with my sister to Israel for a week. I will leave it right there. The 2 ladies that heard my father play the piano in Vienna happened to be aunts of my own mother. They came from Breslau. Now it's Wrocław. Now it's in Poland. Back then it was in Germany. And they all ended up on the same ship. And apparently I did not know that my father had quite a bit of Jewish education, because he came actually from a secular family. My mother came from an Orthodox family, so she knew all the prayers and everything, and they lit the Shabbat candles and Hanukkah candles and Passover Seder, and they did the whole thing. But he taught those 2 aunts Hebrew on the ship. And And then, because they were aunts of my mother started to know this guy. And I think something ignited between them. And that spark continued even during the detention for 10 months, from December of 1940 to September of 1941. They were at the camp. During that camp, during that time, in January actually, my father received a telegram from his brother. You remember the brother who left in 1934 with my grandmother? I told her I'll tell you again. To tell my father that their mother is gravely ill, to ask permission from the British to give him 24 hours to go to see his mother for the last time. They say, why would we do that? We have no assurance you'll come back. You're just not going to go. Well, 3 days later, he got another telegram that their mother passed away. So it was 7 years, from 34 to 41, that my father did not see his mother. I never met her. I never met any of my grandparents. I never had grandparents. They all died before I was born. And I think it's a grave disadvantage not to have grandparents. And anyone here who has grandparents, count your blessings. Then an organization that started to settle all the detainees and so forth in Israel came to the camp, and they selected my parents with others, and they had a group of German refugees, and eventually they built a kibbutz in Israel, and both my parents stayed there until they passed away. My father passed away in 82, and my mother in 99, 2 days before the new millennia, actually, on 30th of December. So it's 40 years since I lost my father, and it's 23 years since I lost my mother. They had 3 children. I was the oldest. Then I have a brother, and then we have a sister. I mentioned I will go over there. My brother is still in Israel. We have a big family there, and cousins, and so on and so forth. One of my cousin's children from my father's side moved to Germany and became an architect. By the way, my uncle that settled in Tel Aviv was also an architect and a fantastic painter. I brought a picture of him. I have several of those, and if you want later on to look at it, this was painted in 1928 outside Berlin. It's a picture of a lake near Berlin. It's watercolors. See the date at the bottom there. This uncle also taught me painting. He also started me on my stamp collection. Stamp card here. And so I brought some of my own drawings and paintings when I was young. You can look at them. I had all exercises of painting hands, for example. This was an attempt of oil picture and some other variety of abstracts. I'll leave everything here on the table so you can see the effect. Here is a portrait of my father that I did, let's see, 1959. Yeah. This was from photo. He normally did not wear this. He was very smartly dressed, always in Germany. My father was more German than a Jew, like many of the German Jews. He loved the culture, he loved the language, he loved the literature, he loved the composers. And I think what happened to him is that he, in my opinion, he encapsulated this traumatic 12 years of the Holocaust, put them in a box, did not want to ever open this box again. He wanted to hark back on the things that he loved, the music, the language. He could not believe that such a cultural, advanced country would do such a thing. He could not fathom it. He was part of the society. As I told you, my grandfather served in World War I on the front. So when I served as a rabbi in Mississippi, I also met another man who was 9 years old, and he saw several of his relatives killed in front of him, and he never spoke about it again. He was also shot like a clam, but other people know about him, and it was just horrific to know what happened. Third story. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a man, not part of our family, not yet, by the name of Julius Lask, L-A-S-K. It's a variation of the more common Lasker. Perhaps you know of Emanuel Lasker, one of the greatest chess players in the last century. He had two sons, Julius Jr. and Gustav. When Julius became a bar mitzvah, he received from Julius, his father, a beautiful, what we call Kiddush cup, a sanctification, silver-plated cup for the usage of wine in Jewish festivals and the Sabbath. Here it is. I know you're wondering how come I have it, right? That's a story I want to tell you about, and you're welcome to look at it up close later. When Julius Jr. died, his brother Gustav received this cup from his father. He said, "Your brother died, I want you to have it." Gustav ended up in the northern city of Kiel in Germany, almost on the Danish border. And he opened a store for silver and jewelry. He became very famous, very well known, that even the prince of that whole province visited the store often for the goods that he could sell. One day, he walked from, his home was not far. He walked towards his home after he closed the store, and two Nazi soldiers shot him in the back. He was only maybe 200, 300 yards from his home. He fell on his face, and the soldiers left him for dead. They saw the blood coming and said, "Forget it. Don't worry." But he didn't die. He was severely injured. But he managed to crawl to a house nearby. And a lady somehow heard his sighs. And she came out, and she couldn't believe her eyes, and she immediately called ambulance or whatever. They came and picked him up and brought him to the university hospital in Kiel. The main surgeon immediately recognized him because, as I said, he was quite famous in town. It's not a very large town, and instructed any of the doctors, nobody approaches this room of Gustav Lask, no one. Eventually he recovered. By then he married a lady who was also my mother's aunt, one of my mother's aunts by the name of Johanna. Johanna Hoffmann was her maiden name. When she married, she became also Johanna Lask. By then, 1938, they already had two daughters who left for London. And although Gustav and Johanna were also Zionists, and they wanted to end up in Palestine, it was easier for them now to go to England because they could get the lending certificates and everything, and they already had 2 daughters, and that's what they did. But they couldn't take all their possessions with them. By the way, the store was completely taken by the Nazis. Very little was left. And Gustav then, or Johanna, his wife, asked my grandmother, my mother's mother, to take some of the goods and to keep it until who knows when, because they couldn't take everything to England. So they did. Now, they knew that the Nazis are going to also go and search homes, and not only homes, but also in the gardens of homes, because many people buried their treasures because they knew the Nazis are coming to grab it. My grandfather, who was the textile merchant, had a secretary, not Jewish, very fine lady. She lived just outside of Berlin. And he asked her if she was willing to hide these treasures in her garden. And she agreed. And they dug in her garden, and they put the suitcase with a lot of other stuff in there, covered it, and that's 1938. The war goes on. My parents are now in Palestine. And my mother heard from the Red Cross. Occasionally, she got letters until 1942. All of a sudden, the letters completely stopped. She first thought something was wrong, and then she thought something was very wrong, and she was right. Interestingly enough, when my mother told her parents that she's going to go to Palestine, they told her, "You are mad. You're crazy." She says, "Why?" He said, because he said, the Italians, you know, Mussolini joined Hitler. The Italians are bombing Haifa every day, which was true. And he said to her, "Stay here. You will be much safer in Germany. It can't get worse." That was a slogan that the Jews started from 1933. It can't get worse. Let's stay. It can get worse. After Kristallnacht, 250 synagogues were burned down, thousands of businesses were ransacked, hundreds of Jews were killed. It can't get worse. Well, guess what? It got worse. That's the irony. She survived, and my grandparents did not, because they thought that Germany was safer than Palestine. After the war, Israel began to restore relationship with the new government, the Adenauer regime in Germany. And the first thing that the Germans did was to enact a law of reparations. Of course, there was a lot of red tape. You had to submit all kinds of documents to show what you had and what happened to your family. And my parents received quite a bit of, reparations. Of course, nothing compared to what they had. But there were still people who went back to Europe to look for MIAs, missing in action, partisans. There was one woman very famous, Hannah Senesh, who was Hungarian, who came to Palestine and then volunteered, and she parachuted over Hungary to help the partisans and the resistance. She was caught and executed by the Nazis. She was 23 years old. She was a poetess. She wrote beautiful songs. We still have some of her songs sung in our Shabbat services, in fact. So there was a gentleman in that kibbutz who decided to go back to Europe to look for those missing in action. And my mother heard about it, and his name was Kurt Goldman. She approached Kurt and said, "Are you by any chance going to Berlin or to the vicinity?" He said, "Yes, I'm going there." She told him the story about the buried treasure. And she said, if by chance, if you have by chance the time, here is the address. They had no idea if the lady was still alive or what happened. She said, just take a chance if you can. He said, I'll do my best. Lo and behold, he came, he found the ladies was still around. She remembered everything. She even remembered where the treasure was buried. She went there with her son or someone else. They dug it out, and they gave the suitcase to Kurt Goldman, who then shipped it in a crate back to Israel. So in 1950, or thereabout, my mother received all the goods that were buried there, including this cup. This is now more than 150 years old. And before my mother passed away, she gave inheritance of some of her belongings to spread among my brother, my sister, and I ended up with this cup. Quite amazing. Last story. We wanted to commemorate our grandparents, and in 2017, we heard about a campaign in Germany that started by a gentleman by the name of Gunther Demnig, who decided to approach the German government. He had an idea to commemorate those who fled Germany or Europe and to put a bronze plaque in front of the last known house or apartment of the victims. That plaque is called Stolperstein, which means stumbling stone. There are more than 100,000 plaques today all over Europe. When I heard about it first, I said, no, I don't want to do that because I don't want people to just walk over them. But then I heard from other people say, no, they're really well taken care of by the people who live there. They clean it, they polish it, and people actually look at it and they stopped and they're seeing what's written there. We started to do all kind of search, especially my daughter, on Googling institution or whatever. We found the right people, and we found out that Czechoslovakia was the right country to do it. And in August of 2018, all four of us went to Prague to lay a brass plaque for my uncle, who died in Auschwitz, the musician, and his wife, who also died eventually in 2010. Her name was Susie. Susie survived Auschwitz and also the death march that followed when the Soviets already came close. The Nazis started to push all those survivors into the forests, through the snow. Hundreds died on the road. Susie survived. She was young. She survived. And she then met another widower whose wife and baby were also killed in the Holocaust. And they got married. He was a lawyer. And she said to him, you know, I always wanted to go back to Palestine. Now the war is over, I want to go. And he said, okay, let's go. So they went. She was a brilliant pianist. She was immediately admitted as a professor of piano, both in the Jerusalem Conservatory and in the Tel Aviv Conservatory. But her husband had a hard time finding work. One day my mother says to me, I'm going to take you to Jerusalem. I want you to meet a very special lady. She told me a little bit about it, but not much. I was very young. It was the first big trip that I took. We went by train, took several hours. Eventually we ended up in an apartment building that a friend in Jerusalem lent them, and the husband actually went to go with another friend so that Susie could be with my mother and with me. And I met her. She was a beautiful lady, blonde. And we also went to a concert of the Jerusalem Symphony. I still remember that, my very first concert. I even remember the program, believe it or not. In the morning, I asked my mother how she was doing. I saw she was a little bit out of it. And she said, I'm sorry, but I didn't sleep all night. I said, why? She said, Susie and I spoke throughout the night. We spoke about everything that happened to her and to me. I met Susie. My uncles, the one who perished in Auschwitz, I met this lady. When we decided to go to Czechoslovakia, then eventually they left back to Vienna, and first to Prague and then to Vienna, because her husband couldn't find work. And we did some research about her, and we found that there was a kind of an article by two German ladies, Viennese ladies, who did search about women artists during the Holocaust. And we found out that in this article, Susie is mentioned. So we contacted those ladies. There were some links and stuff like that. Eventually, we got to know that she had a son by the name of Gabriel, and he is also a lawyer in Vienna, and he had two sons who also live in Vienna. We managed to contact the son, who speaks very well English. He was actually 1 year in Stanford, so we could actually not Zoom, it was Skype at that time, and we arranged all the things that before we go to Prague for the ceremony, we will visit with them in Vienna. We had a great time, and in fact, Gabriel and two of his sons came also to Prague to be with us, and they went to Theresienstadt. We all went there. We saw the building where my uncle was, where Susie was, where her parents was, and where my grandparents were. But remember, they separated them. The children were with the women. The fathers could not see their children at all for as long as they were there. But Theresienstadt was sort of an exemplary camp, in quotation, to show the Red Cross how well they are treated, and there was orchestra there and theater. The one thing that they did not tell them is that every day, at least 50 of the inhabitants of the camp were shipped to Auschwitz, and then new 50 people filled their place. So we went to Theresienstadt, and we saw it all. And we saw also the prison, and the place where they put in a small room, like maybe around like this, they stuck 50 people throughout the night. They closed the door, no air. In the morning, they all were dead. And that is another place that you have Arbeit macht frei. You probably labor will make you free. The famous one in Auschwitz. It's also in Theresienstadt. We still wanted to do the same thing for my family in Germany, but then COVID came and we had to postpone it. Eventually we got on top of that again and we arranged for everything. And this last July and August, all four of us went again to Berlin. We put a plaque in front of my father's apartment. And by the way, so a few weeks, his brother, the architect who left for Palestine, also lived in the same place. And then 3 plaques where my mother lived in a completely different neighborhood. We also went on our first day to a Jewish cemetery in Berlin, which is the largest in Europe. In that cemetery are buried 115,000 Jews. It's absolutely enormous. But they had catalog for the whole area. Again, I don't know if the Germans or the Jews kept it, but there are now guards and all kind of people there. And we got hold of them, and they told us exactly where my great-grandparents lived, buried, excuse me. And we went there. And through there was really a jungle. I mean, they have a few workers there, but this is so large, they can't keep up with the ivy and the Virginia creeper, whatever, and a lot of broken limbs there. It's just terrifically difficult to discover. But we found both tombstones of my great-grandfather from my mother's side and my grandfather from my father's side. There, we found it there. 2 pictures, of course. We want to make sure that our children are part. We have children here. This is very important, that we pass this legacy to the children. That, as Gavin said before, the survivors are gone. Every day, more of them are gone. So if we don't keep the story, if we don't keep the heritage, it will completely be gone. And we cannot let that happen because it's our story. The Holocaust is our story. It happens by humans to humans. As awful as it is, it happened. And thank you very much for bringing this exhibit here. I really appreciate it. I know many of you are also appreciating it. It's an important thing to do. I thank you very much for listening. And if you have some questions, I know we are a little bit over time, but you told us we can have a few seconds, few minutes, okay? I'll be happy to answer anything you want. Otherwise, again, as I said, I left some materials on the room here, and I have some things here. I can bring up the photos on my phones for anyone who would like to see those plaques that we put. I have an old phone and a new phone, so I saved them both, and let's see if I can find them here.